Anne, and I'd like to welcome you to Season 3 of the Hearts Afire Podcast. Over the past month, there has been much discussion about today's episode topic, human trafficking. As you may already know, January marked Human Trafficking Awareness Month, and yesterday, February 8th, was International Day of Prayer and Awareness Against Human Trafficking, as well as the feast day of St. Josephine Bakhita, the patroness of the work to end human trafficking. Before we get to our discussion, I'd like to remind you that whether you're watching this episode live or listening to it on a podcast, make sure to never miss an episode by clicking the subscribe button now. We appreciate your support of the Hearts Afire podcast. Now on to today's discussion with our guest, Sister Arlene Flaherty. For those of you who don't know her, Sister Arlene is the Director of the Office of Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation for the School Sisters of Notre Dame. And now I'd like to welcome Sister Arlene. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Katie. Thanks for giving us time to talk about this really important topic.
Absolutely. And let's dive right into it. So, Sister Arlene, can you let our listeners know what is human trafficking and why should we care about it?
Human trafficking is the third largest illicit industry in the world today. It earns a profit of about $150 billion a year. And I'm going to give you the legal definition for human trafficking that's used by the United Nations and other groups. So human trafficking involves the recruitment, the transportation, the transfer, the harboring, the receiving of people by force, fraud, or coercion or deception with the aim of really exploiting them. So men, women, and children of all ages and from all different countries and backgrounds can become victims easily of human trafficking, which is also called modern-day slavery. And experts in this field today estimate that there's about 40 million victims of human trafficking at any given time globally. Very difficult to pinpoint that statistics because, of course, this industry operates in the shadows and is very clandestine. So many of the people who are in human trafficking are slaves in labor markets, and others are being exploited on international sex trade, and others in forced marriages. I think the reason, a good question, why should we care about this? Well, first of all, I think people who are exploited as slaves, people who are trafficked, are denied their basic human dignity, their rights, and their freedom. And fundamentally, this egregious crime of exploitation is really an assault on human dignity, on our own humanity. And it holds the God-given potential that each one of us has in the clutches of exploiters who use that potential for their profit-driven ambitions. Human trafficking really thrives on human vulnerability. And that's really the core of this illicit business. It's really based on exploiting human vulnerability. And when people are made vulnerable, and we can all be made vulnerable, but when people are made vulnerable because of economic downturns in their countries, because of wars, because of climate change or natural disasters, because of the political climate of their countries, when people are made vulnerable, they deserve our care. And so, but human traffickers are really opportunists who roam the terrain of human vulnerability in search of victims. And through force and fraud and coercion, they take advantage of people who are made vulnerable and exploit them for economic gain. I'll just give you a quick example of something to point to this issue of human vulnerability and human traffickers. A few years ago, a friend of mine, Sister Jean Devos, an IHM sister, was on a plane, really a relief plane that was going to Pakistan after Pakistan's earthquake. And she was going to be sent there as a relief worker. On the very plane with her were known human traffickers. They were on their way into this vulnerable situation where people's lives had been upended by an earthquake. And what they were going to do was to pose themselves fraudulently as aid workers so that they could really capture women and children and other vulnerable people under the guise of giving them help, and then eventually get them into the slave market.
Wow.
Well, yeah, incredible. This is how they work in these clandestine situations.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that with us. And, for you personally, what has been your own experience with human trafficking?
It's really interesting when I look back over like 4 decades of my ministry of as a Blood Belt Dominican sister. I can point to several incidences in my ministry life where I was face to face with the situation of human trafficking. And one of them was very, very early. I was a novice, and I was working then at St. Dominic's Home, which is now St. Dominic's Family Services. I was working in a group home right there on Western Highway called Jairus House. And, we would receive referrals from, the state or city for children who were vulnerable in need of our care. We received a referral of a young girl. She was probably maybe 15 years old, who, ostensibly had run away from home and was on the road for about a year. And in those days, what we described it as was she was prostituted, right? She was prostituted. In fact, what we would say today is that this girl who had been hitchhiking on Route 95, the interstate from Florida to New York, was trafficked by truck drivers.
Oh my goodness.
Yes. Now, this is one of the sites, truck stops, etc., one of the sites where human traffickers also thrive. So she was a child who had been trafficked. And my experience with her was that, she was a kid that was so traumatized, and it would take, much of our effort, years and years of services to her to help her to recover from that. And please God, she did. But that was one of my first experiences. But subsequently, like, for example, when I worked in Catholic Relief Services, I learned, because we were fundamentally a humanitarian and relief organization, that in many of these places that I described before, like Pakistan or Haiti or Banda Aceh, when they had a tsunami, we would have to set up child protection sites every time we went into a place where there had been a natural disaster, child and women protection, simply because of the issue that child traffickers also are there and are ready to, exploit that situation. I just tell a quick story there. I remember when there was a tsunami in Banda Aceh, and huge fishing boats were upturned, right? Because of these huge 100-foot tidal waves. Fishing was a major industry in Banda Aceh. And so, Catholic Relief Services was very, interested and focused on righting those boats so that the industry could continue and people could make a livelihood. Right. Well, when they started to talk to the fishermen who worked on those boats, what they found out was that they were all slaves in the fishing. Yeah. So alternatively, instead of getting that slave industry back up and going, what they did was form cooperatives among these fisher people, and each one got their own boats. And then together they began to recreate freely a fishing industry and livelihoods that was no longer tainted with human trafficking. So you can see, how situations of human vulnerability in my life, as I worked within them, I have encountered human trafficking. I remember the Yazidis. I don't know if you remember them, but during the wars in Iraq and Syria, that was a group of people that were really trapped by ISIS up on the Sinjar Mountains. And their women were taken and sold into the slave markets of Mosul in Iraq. And when I went there to interview them, what we discovered, an amazing story, a wonderful story, was that when they were sent to the slave markets, this particular group of Yazidi women were actually purchased by a Muslim man. And they had fully expected that, they would be brought into a brothel or something like that, so that this person could exploit, their bodies sexually for, his own financial gain. But in fact, what happened was that when they reached his home, he had a bunch of people there to actually take care of them. And his intention was not to put them in the brothel, but to return them back to their families. And I met them when aid agencies like Catholic Relief Services were overseeing their reintegration, into their families. Right now, I'm working with a non-governmental organization on behalf of the School Sisters of Notre Dame called Beyond Borders. And we work in Haiti. And much of the work that we're doing within this partnership is to end the practice of child domestic slavery in Haiti. In any given time, there's about 300,000 children in domestic slavery in Haiti within their own country. So we have programs to support their own families of origin so that they are not forced to send their children away into domestic slavery, because their intention in sending them to people as domestic helpers, they think their child is going to be a domestic helper. The intention of the family of origin is that the child will have a better chance of survival if they're in a family of a slightly higher income, that the child might be given food or even education. But as we know, that situation really disintegrates quickly, and more often than not, sadly, the child becomes a victim of exploitation and physical and also sexual abuse. Those children are called rest-a-vex, and we're trying through our work to end that. Yeah.
So, Sister Arlene, kind of shifting topics, you've obviously had a lot of experience with human trafficking, but for the ordinary American, how are their lives intertwined with human trafficking?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think a very important question, Katie, because the fact is that human trafficking, human slavery is embedded in the supply chain globally. And it's in the food that we eat, it's in the chocolate that we enjoy, it's in the clothing that we wear, it's in the holiday decorations, that we buy in the dollar store, whatever. Much of our lives is really contaminated. We're unconscious of it, but really contaminated with human slavery. And the reason for that is, like Americans, like others, really demand cheap goods. And so the price, there's a price to pay, I would say, for unwillingness to pay for products that are made with a living wage. And human slaves, are the ones, who are in sweatshops all over the world, who are really paying the price, right, that we refuse to pay. I would really encourage people who are on this podcast to go to a website that is called slaveryfootprint, I think, .org. And it's a very interesting website because it has a survey that you can take very quickly so that you can become aware of how in your daily life you might be consciously or unconsciously purchasing goods that are manufactured by slaves.
And for those of you who are watching right now, we posted the link on the screen. That's www.slaveryfootprint.org/survey.
And we're unconscious of the fact that many times, in restaurants that we go to, there are people there who are trafficked, perhaps people who came here to this country undocumented, and some kind of false employment recruiter picked them up, took their passports, promised them a job, and then put them into a service industry where that trafficker, that recruiter, is actually making money off of them. And people are coerced into staying in it because their passports are held, or perhaps that same illegal trafficker, that recruiter, is also threatening their families back home if this person speaks out. So human slaves are in the mining industry, they're in the fishing industries, they're in the logging industries, they're in our oil industries, all kinds of service industries, they're gardeners, they're maids. It's everywhere, in our lives. It's also at sporting events. And this is one of the largest venues, like, say, for example, the Super Bowl, the World Cup, Wimbledon, these sporting events where people come and sometimes spend days ahead of time before the actual event in a hotel, and they have a kind of an anonymity. Nobody's checking on them or whatever. They have a demand for sexual services, and traffickers will provide that.
Yeah, I've always heard about, especially with the Super Bowl, you always see afterwards, it doesn't matter where it is, that there's been arrests made with human trafficking, and it's you always see that with very big events.
The Super Bowl was in New Jersey a number of years ago, just a couple of years ago, really. And the sisters in the area were very active raising awareness about the potential. And as a matter of fact, I think there were something like 40 children who were rescued, who had been really children who were missing, right? Who were missing, that were found. And traffickers, I think in the 60s, maybe as many as 60 traffickers were arrested. Who had brought these children to the Super Bowl for the purposes of exploitation.
Yeah, it's something that you often just don't think about, as you go around for your day-to-day life. When I was in San Francisco for a wedding this past October, I remember being in the airport, and in all the bathroom stalls, there were signs about saying, are you a human trafficking victim? If so, call this line, and it's something you never think about. And, it was nice that the airport had that. And I hope more airports and high, international travel areas do that.
That's right. Yep.
So obviously, with your ministry, you've had a tremendous amount of experience with human trafficking, and you do great work. And kind of talking about the congregation now as a whole, how is the mission of the Sisters of St. Dominic of Blauvelt intertwined with human trafficking?
When I was thinking about this question, it was really, really good for me to reflect on that. And what really came to me was that one of the most effective strategies, probably the most effective strategies to combat human trafficking, is to reduce human vulnerability. So, and to help those who are made vulnerable, by forces like migration or poverty, economic downturns, gender injustice, to really work to reduce human vulnerability is really a very effective strategy to end human trafficking. So in my own experience, I would say, the Blauvelt Dominican Sisters and our associates and our larger networks have really been making an extraordinary contribution in reducing the prevalence of human trafficking by deliberately choosing to minister to vulnerable populations, particularly those who would be, I would say, vulnerable to human trafficking. So we've done this through making these choices to work with vulnerable populations and providing then education and counseling and healthcare services and job training and pastoral services for those who are imprisoned, providing housing for vulnerable women and children, and working with migrant farm workers and their children. And this has really been a hallmark of Blauvelt mission. And so in doing this work, consciously or unconsciously, we've been making a tremendous contribution to the ending of human trafficking. I want to also say that, foster care, children who are in foster care are one of the largest cohorts in this country, in the United States, who are vulnerable to trafficking. Traffickers go after these children and exploit their vulnerability and their yearning for connection with other people. And, I want to say that the Blauvelt Dominicans are really proud of our founding ministry, St. Dominic's Family Services, which has really built up strength and resilience, human dignity, built up the capacity and the skills in vulnerable children that have come to our care in the foster care system, and thus giving them what they need to really prevent them from going into the hands of people who would exploit them. So in the United States alone, there's 10 to 15, maybe 20,000 cases of human trafficking every year that are reported. And sadly, many of these cases are children who have been in the foster care system.
Wow.
One of the things we've also done as a congregation is we've supported the Lifeway Network, which is with some of the founding members of that network, which is really an agency that's dedicated to care for victims and to build the capacity of victims of human trafficking.
And I know besides the work you do with our sisters, associates in the greater, Dominican network, that you're also very involved with another organization that does a great deal of work to fight against human trafficking, which is the U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking. How are you involved with this organization?
Well, first of all, that organization is part of a larger network called Talitha Kum, which is a network it's an international network of women religious who are working to end human trafficking. And U.S. Catholic Sisters is the U.S. Agency within that network that's working to end human trafficking. It's composed of 100 congregations of Catholic sisters, and Blood Belt Dominicans, of course, are one of them. And my work there is on the legislative advocacy committee of that organization. And so primarily what we do is we really advocate for national policies within the United States and sometimes international policies as well that will really prevent or put an end to human trafficking to the best of our ability. So we work pretty much on legislative policies and do advocacies around that. I don't know if you're aware of this, but one of the policies that we're really promoting right now is the Earn It Act, which is before Congress as we're speaking. And this Earn It Act is really about trying to put policies in place in the United States around the internet that will prevent what we realize now is an incredible growth of child sexual exploitation material on the web. So traffickers now are trafficking in child images. And this is not just child porn, not that I should say just, it's not child porn, it's really even a more explicit and difficult form of child pornography, which is the torture of children. And so, believe it or not, there's a huge market for this. So before the pandemic, police and others were looking at, about 47 million images, videos, etc., of children, illicit videos of children that were posted on the web. During the pandemic, that number has doubled. So it's because of the time that children are spending online and traffickers are there and exploiting them and frightening them and making them upload images of themselves that are then, peddled on the dark web, etc. So we have a bill, the U.S. Sisters Against Human Trafficking have a bill that we're supporting called To Do, the Earn It Act, to end the immunity that internet providers have had for a number of years. They are really immune from prosecution when a third party uses their site to, for egregious work, for clandestine work, for human trafficking. So we're trying to remove that immunity, that given immunity, so that the internet service providers will exercise a great deal of vigilance about who's using their site and for what purposes. So we are basically, that's the kernel of it, is to create a kind of hypervigilance in the industry so that this demand for child pornography and child sexual exploitative material will be decreased and hopefully eliminated.
Wow, I hope it passes, and please keep us updated on that. And if there's anything that our listeners can do to support the U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking and the great organization as a whole, let us know.
Thank you. I certainly will.
And for those of you who are watching right now, if you want to learn more about the U.S. Catholic Sisters Against Human Trafficking, you can visit their website, sistersagainsttrafficking.org. We posted the link on the video feed, and if you're listening, it's sistersagainsttrafficking.org, and I encourage everybody to visit that website to learn about the organization and to see what Sister Arlene and others do to protect those who are most vulnerable. And final question for today, Sister Arlene, if we have a reason to suspect human trafficking, a human trafficking situation in the course of our daily lives, what should we not do and what should we do?
I would advise the first thing not to do is to try to confront the situation by yourself. And, traffickers belong to cartels, and they are heavily funded, and they're often heavily armed. So the first thing to do is, take note, try to describe, for yourself what you're watching, and then use the toll-free number to report it. And it will be followed up by investigation. And the toll-free number is 1-866-347-2423, and it's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year. So thank you for posting that number, and we would encourage people to do that. Something else I think that we can do to be effective in the work of ending human trafficking is to be aware of just how your lifestyle and the choices that you make for commodities that you purchase and so on are intertwined with slave labor. And you already got that website, knowyourslaveryfootprint.org, and educate yourself about that and make choices. For example, Valentine's Day is coming up. And if you enjoy chocolate or plan to give chocolate to somebody, go online and really read about the chocolate companies that you should avoid, because these chocolate companies are not doing due diligence on their supply chains. And the cocoa industry is notorious for slave labor, particularly child labor. So find a chocolate that is a fair trade chocolate. And one of them I would recommend is Divine Chocolate, Divine. It's terrific, and you can buy it on Amazon, and it's slave-free. And it's a great way to support the industry of chocolate that is really trying to eliminate slave labor in it. And I would say continue to do whatever you can do to reduce human vulnerability, through your work in communication like you're doing. Katie, this is important to get the word out about human trafficking. And this is one of the ways, right? It's one of the ways that we can end it, is getting the word out, but also through our ministries of education, providing good health care, housing, etc. And support acts like the Earn It Act that are going through Congress. And I'll give you some information about that later, Katie, that we can post perhaps.
Sure.
So, I just want to say in a shout out that it's not all bad news, as difficult as it is to work in this sphere. I want to give a special shout out to all the hotel chains globally that are doing tremendous work and who have signed the pledge, what we call it, which is a way to educate their employees on what to watch for when clients come, and to be extra vigilant about trafficking and how to report it. They have done a great deal to end human trafficking. And I'd also like to give a shout out to Truckers Against Trafficking. At the beginning of the podcast, I talked about the little girl that we had who was trafficked on truck sites. And believe it or not, within the last 10 years, this coalition called Truckers Against Trafficking have been just so effective in terms of reporting incidences of trafficking that they see in their own truck sites and in their world. And I want to talk about the airline industry, who have been posting, even sometimes within the seat that you're in. If you suspect something of trafficking, here's what you should do. They've been fabulous about ending, their industry's complicity in moving trafficking victims around the world. And I just remind you to think thoughtfully about the foods that you eat. If you're eating such things as tuna fish, which is notorious to have slave labor within it, research the tuna fish that you enjoy and see which ones you can eat that are relatively free of slavery. Also chocolate. As I said before, Valentine's Day is a great time to do something.
Yeah, really, Divine Chocolate.
Right, Divine Chocolate is absolutely delicious. So.
All right. Yeah. And thank you for all that, and, for sharing your insight and expertise on this issue. It's important that we continue to raise awareness about that, support the organizations, the industries, and individuals who are fighting to end human trafficking. And on behalf of our listeners, Sister Arlene, I want to thank you for joining us today. And I hope that you will join us for future discussions.
I will, Katie, and I want to thank you very much for your ministry in this kind of broadcasting and communications, because you've done so much really to end social injustices and to promote issues that we should all know about. So thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Sister Arlene. Have a good one.
Okay, you too.
And before we go, I'd like to remind you that If you enjoyed today's discussion, please let us know by giving the Hearts Afire podcast a 5-star rating on wherever you listen to your podcasts. We hope that you will join us in 2 weeks for our next episode of the Hearts Afire podcast, where our guest, Sister Kathleen McManus, will discuss her new book and ministry. Thank you again for tuning in to today's episode with Sister Arlene Flaherty, and please know that you are in the daily prayers of our sisters and associates.